Good evening and welcome to Selected Shorts. I'm Jane Kaczmarek, your host for this virtual edition of Shorts. And, here we are in our laptops, far away from one another and wishing we were closer, but, hey, let's look at the advantages, shall we? Okay, let's start with wardrobe. You are in those sweatpants, stained with, what is that, mustard? Me? I wore this, but I could easily be in a muumuu or a bathrobe. So sure, maybe our movements are restricted, but fashion has never been so freeing. Or maybe we're finally free from fashion. Look, if I start wearing a bed sheet around like a toga or just a trash bag with no underwear, then you call me out. But until we get to that stage, let's enjoy it. Now, if you know our show, you know that what we do is seek the best short stories we can find and perform those stories on stage. In times at which we can be within 6 feet of one another, our performances happen live at Selected Shorts Home Theater of Symphony Space on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and in other locations across the country. While I live in LA, Pasadena, thanks to the magic of the internet, I can host this show for you, regardless of where you are. So we know that our world and each of us as individuals are going through a lot. And in a moment of massive upheaval, we thought we might reflect on some of life's little rebellions. Our stories tonight deal with everyday relationships and social niceties, and what happens when someone bucks the norm. Our first story is by the writer Amelia Gray. She's the author of smart and visceral story collections including AM/PM and Gutshot, as well as novels including Threats. This tale takes on the rituals of gratitude, and after hearing it, you may never look at a thank you card in the same way again. I am going to be the one to read this one. And listen, it's hard to introduce yourself, so I'm just going to say this. Jane Kaczmarek, range, mezzo-soprano, special skills, blog dancing. Malcolm's mom on Malcolm in the Middle, but also Mary Tyrone from Long Day's Journey into Night. Wow, she's got range. So have your people call my people when we can all be in the same room together, and we can be in the same room together, okay? This is Amelia Gray's Thank You. Thank you. The woman checked her mail every afternoon, and one day she found a card from her friend. The card was pale green and decorated with filigrees and flowers. It was lovely. Inside, the woman's friend had written a sweet note thanking the woman for a baby shower gift she had sent from a catalog. "Oh, it's such a beautiful card," said the woman, turning it over. She wanted to show her appreciation for the sentiment presented and the effort implied, even that her friend was quite pregnant and still thought to sit down and write a heartfelt note and a darling card. Well, the woman sat down at her own desk and she opened her drawer, exacting a few options. One card was festive, with holly sprigs and a touch of glitter. Another featured a nautical stripe and a jaunty anchor. The woman, feeling the season appropriate, chose the first. She picked a fresh pen and she wrote, "Thank you for your kind thank you card. I appreciate so much that you considered our friendship this month, and I so look forward to meeting the new addition to your family. All my love." She signed her name, addressed, stamped the envelope, slipped the card inside, and dropped it in the mail. Well, some days passed, and the woman received another letter. Inside its sturdy envelope, the cream-colored card was, well, it was embossed with her friend's name on the front, and inside of that, with the woman's name. Ha! The woman gasped with delight. She sat down in her office to read, "Thank you, my dear, for the thoughtful thank you card in response to your thank you card. It pleased me greatly to see your response, and I count you as one of my most polite friends. Yours." Wow, such a thoughtful gesture. She immediately picked a card from her drawer. This time it was a sunny yellow one with 4 butterflies in a line. And inside she wrote, "Thank you for your thank you card, recognizing my thank you card for your thank you card. We are truly friends." This returned sentiment seemed slightly less personal, and the woman panicked before remembering that the small craft supply she kept for her children to play with when she worked late was just under the desk. She uncapped a tube of silver glitter, and she deposited a healthy quarter cup into the envelope before inserting the card. She dropped it in the mail and went to bed. 8 days later, a brown paper package arrived. The woman took it up to her room, and inside she found a handful of bright, cherry bombs! And a decorative plate on which her friend had painted the words, "Thank you." Well, the woman lit a cherry bomb. She threw it into her bathtub, and she watched it crack merrily about, thinking of her friend's thoughtful nature. The woman spent the afternoon assembling supplies to make a chocolate cake. She waited patiently for it to cool. She piped raspberry cream between the layers and at the base. She found a box that would fit the cake and tore out all the pages of 5 of her favorite books, running them through the shredder to make a nice nest to travel on. And then, discovering she was out of pastry cream, she wrote "thanks" on an empty paper towel roll and affixed it to the frosting. By the time the postman picked it up the next morning, a fluid had condensed, leaving a sticky ring on the mailroom floor. She began to have trouble sleeping. A postal tube arrived. She opened it, and it released 8 disoriented white mice. They tumbled out in a line, and they scrambled for safety. Well, she gave them water and sliced up an apple, but was confused by their presence until later that evening when, save for one, they seized and they made tiny bowel movements that respectively produced alphabet beads T, H, A, N, K, O, and U. The last mouse was uncomfortably constipated in a life-threatening way until she took him to the vet and had the Y extracted at an expense of $45. A fever gripped the woman and she was bound to her bed for a week. When she could walk again, she set immediately to work. She mixed industrial buckets of yellow lye, loaded them up after dark, drove to the park, which featured swings for children and a community garden and a broad green lawn. The next morning, she set up an old VCR to record the news and drank coffee while she rebandaged her chemical burns. Sure enough, came in live. The morning news was live from the grassy field. Yes, and there was a clip of the landscape workers being piled into the back of a police truck. One of them was crying. There was a good live shot of the "thanks" on the grass, still smoking comically from burned patches. There was talk of reevaluating local law enforcement, of adding cameras. Well, she popped the tape into the mail that afternoon. And that following week, the woman opened her door to find a baby boy in a basket. And although he was too small to speak, she knew exactly what he was going to say when he did. Okay, damn it. Dare I say thank you? Thank you very much. Probably best I can't hear your applause because we've just learned about how difficult it is to escape the vicious cycle of thanks. So I'll take that silence as a lesson learned. Our next story is by Haruki Murakami, the Japanese fabulist behind titles including The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, IQ 84, and many more. He's also a wonderful short story writer, and as this tale illustrates, he slips into strangeness and whimsy, often without the reader noticing. To read this story, we've got a first-time shorts reader, a very, very funny actor that we've been hoping to feature for some time now. He's known for his roles in series including Fresh Off the Boat and Veep, and films including Aquaman and Always Be My Maybe, a movie he also co-wrote. Now, here to read Haruki Murakami's On Seeing the 100% Perfect Girl One Beautiful April Morning, here's Randall Park.
Thanks, Jane. On Seeing the 100% Perfect Girl One Beautiful April Morning. One beautiful April morning, on a narrow side street in Tokyo's fashionable Harajuku neighborhood, I walked past the 100% perfect girl. Tell you the truth, she's not that good looking. She doesn't stand out in any way. Her clothes are nothing special. The back of her hair is still bent out of shape from sleep. She isn't young either, must be near 30, not even close to a girl, properly speaking. But still, I know from 50 yards away, she's the 100% perfect girl for me. The moment I see her, there's a rumbling in my chest and my mouth is as dry as a desert. Maybe you have your own particular favorite type of girl, one with slim ankles, say, or big eyes, or graceful fingers, or you're drawn for no good reason to girls who take their time with every meal. I have my own preferences, of course. Sometimes in a restaurant, I'll catch myself staring at the girl at the next table to mine because I like the shape of her nose. But no one can insist that his 100% perfect girl correspond to some preconceived type. Much as I like noses, I can't recall the shape of hers, or even if she had one. All I can remember for sure is that she was no great beauty. It's weird. Yesterday on the street, I passed the 100% girl. I tell someone, "Yeah?" he says. "Good looking?" Not really." "Your favorite type, then?" I don't know. I can't seem to remember anything about her, the shape of her eyes or the size of her breasts. Strange. Yeah, strange. So, anyhow, he says, already bored, "What did you do? Talk to her? Follow her?" "No, just passed her on the street." She's walking east to west and I west to east. It's a really nice April morning. Wish I could talk to her. Half an hour would be plenty. Just ask her about herself, tell her about myself, and what I'd really like to do, explain to her the complexities of fate that have led to our passing each other on a side street in Harajuku on a beautiful April morning in 1981. This was something sure to be crammed full of warm secrets, like an antique clock built when the peace filled the world. After talking, we'd have lunch somewhere, maybe see a Woody Allen movie, stop by a hotel bar for cocktails. With any kind of luck, we might end up in bed. Potentiality knocks on the door of my heart. Now the distance between us has narrowed to 15 yards. How can I approach her? What should I say? Good morning, miss. Do you think you could spare a half hour for a little conversation?" That's ridiculous. I'd sound like an insurance salesman. Pardon me, would you happen to know if there's an all-night cleaners in the neighborhood?" No, this is just as ridiculous. I'm not carrying any laundry, for one thing. Who's going to buy a line like that? Maybe the simple truth would do. "Good morning. You are the 100% perfect girl for me." Now, she wouldn't believe it. Or even if she did, she might not want to talk to me. "Sorry," she could say. "I might be the 100% perfect girl for you, but you're not the 100% boy for me." It could happen. And if I found myself in that situation, I'd probably go to pieces. I'd never recover from the shock. I'm 32, and that's what growing older is all about. We pass in front of a flower shop. A small, warm air mass touches my skin. The asphalt is damp, and I catch the scent of roses. I can't bring myself to speak to her. She wears a white sweater, and in her right hand she holds a crisp white envelope, lacking only a stamp. So, she's written somebody a letter. Maybe spent the whole night writing, to judge from the sleepy look in her eyes. The envelope could contain every secret she's ever had. I take a few more strides and turn. She's lost in the crowd. Now, of course, I know exactly what I should have said to her. It would have been a long speech, though, far too long for me to have delivered it properly. The ideas I come up with are never very practical. Oh well, it would have started once upon a time and ended. A sad story, don't you think? Once upon a time, there lived a boy and a girl. The boy was 18 and the girl 16. He was not unusually handsome and she was not especially beautiful. They were just ordinary lonely boy and an ordinary lonely girl like all the others. But they believed with their whole hearts that somewhere in the world there lived the 100% perfect boy and the 100% perfect girl for them. Yes, they believed in a miracle. And that miracle actually happened. One day, the two came upon each other on the corner of a street. "This is amazing," he said. "I've been looking for you all my life. You may not believe this, but you're the 100% perfect girl for me. And you," she said to him, "are the 100% perfect boy for me, exactly as I'd pictured you, in every detail. It's like a dream." They sat on a park bench, held hands, and told each other their stories hour after hour. They were not lonely anymore. They had found and been found by their 100% perfect other. What a wonderful thing it is to find and be found by your 100% perfect other. It's a miracle, a cosmic miracle. As they sat and talked, however, a tiny, tiny sliver of doubt took root in their hearts. Was it really all right for one's dream to come true so easily? And so, when there came a momentary lull in their conversation, the boy said to the girl, "Let's test ourselves, just once. If we really are each other's 100% perfect lovers, then sometime, somewhere, we will meet again without fail. And when that happens, we know that we are 100% perfect ones. We'll marry then and there. What do you think?" "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what we should do." And so they parted, she to the east and he to the west. The test they had agreed upon, however, was utterly unnecessary. They should have never undertaken it because they really and truly were each other's 100% perfect lovers, and it was a miracle that they had ever even met. But it was impossible for them to know this, young as they were. The cold, indifferent waves of fate proceeded to toss them unmercifully. One winter, the boy and the girl came down with the season's terrible influenza, and after drifting for weeks between life and death, they lost all memory of their earlier years. When they awoke, their heads were as empty as the young D.H. Lawrence's piggy bank. They were two bright, determined young people, however, and through their unremitting efforts, they were able to acquire once again the knowledge and feeling that qualified them to return as full-fledged members of society. Heaven be praised, they became truly upstanding citizens who knew how to transfer from one subway line to another, who were fully capable of sending a special delivery letter at the post office. Indeed, they even experienced love again, sometimes as much as 75% or even 85% love. Time passed with shocking swiftness, and soon the boy was 32, and the girl 30. One beautiful April morning, in search of a cup of coffee to start the day, the boy was walking from west to east, while the girl, intending to send a special delivery letter, was walking from east to west, but along the same narrow street in the Harajuku neighborhood of Tokyo. They passed each other in the very center of the street. The faintest gleam of their lost memories glimmered for the briefest moment in their hearts. Each felt a rumbling in their chest, and they knew, she is the 100% perfect girl for me. He is the 100% perfect boy for me. But the glow of their memories was far too weak, and their thoughts no longer had the clarity of 14 years earlier. Without a word, they passed each other, disappearing into the crowd. Forever. A sad story, don't you think? Yes, that's it. That is what I should have said to her. And that's the end. Thank you.
That is Randall Park, everyone. Wow. Randall, you seemed very earnest when you read that, like you were, I don't know, thinking of someone very special. Is it too much to imagine? Well, Randall, was it me? Was I the one who got away? Shh. Don't answer that. Not here. Not now. Well, I've got you muted anyway, so you couldn't even if you tried. But if you dedicate the performance to me, Randall, just remain silent. There. We have your answer. Now we're going to hear a story by the prolific Elizabeth Winthrop. Winthrop is best known as the author of books for children and young adults, including The Castle in the Attic and Dumpy LaRue. This perceptive story, which was chosen by the Best American Short Stories collection in 1992, is about rebellion as it relates to family and growing up. It's going to be read by a busy Emmy-winning actor who turned heads in TV series such as The Leftovers and Handmaid's Tale, and features in upcoming films including Cowboys and Rebecca. This is Elizabeth Winthrop's The Golden Darters, performed by Dowd.
Thank you, Jane. The Golden Darters. I was 12 years old when my father started tying flies. It was an odd habit for a man who had just undergone a serious operation on his upper back, but as he remarked to my mother one night, at least it gave him a world over which he had some control. The family grew used to seeing him hunched down close to his tying vise, hackle pliers in one hand, thread bobbin in the other. We began to bandy about strange phrases: foxy quills, botkins, peacock her. Father's corner of the living room was off limits to the maid with the voracious and destructive vacuum cleaner. Who knew what precious bit of calf's tail or rabbit fur would be sucked away, never to be seen again? Because of my father's illness, we had gone up to our summer cottage on the lake in New Hampshire a month early. None of my gang of friends ever came till the end of July, so in the beginning of that summer, I hung around home, watching my father as he fussed with the flies. I was the only child he allowed to stand near him while he worked. "Your brother's bounce," he muttered one day, as he clamped the vise onto the curve of a model-perfect hook. "You can stay and watch if you don't bounce." So I took great care not to bounce, or lean, or even breathe too noisily on him while he performed his delicate maneuvers, holding back hackle with one hand as he pulled off the final flourish of a whip finish with the other. I had never been so close to my father for so long before, and while he studied his tiny creations, I studied him. I stared at the large pores of his skin, the sleek black hair brushed straight back from the soft dip of his temples, the jaw muscles tightening and slackening. Something in my father seemed always to be ticking. He did not take well to sickness and enforced confinement. When he leaned over his work, his shirt collar slipped down to reveal the recent scar, a jagged trail of disrupted tissue. The tender pink skin gradually paled and then toughened during those weeks when he took his prescribed afternoon nap, lying on his stomach on our little patch of front lawn. Our house was one of the closest to the lake, and it seemed to embarrass my mother to have him stretch himself out on the grass for all the swimmers and boaters to see. "At least sleep on the porch," she would say. "That's why we set the hammock up there." "Why shouldn't a man sleep on his own front lawn if he so chooses?" he would reply. "I have to mow the bloody thing. I might as well put it to some use." And my mother would shrug and give up. At the table, when he was absorbed, he lost all sense of anything but the magnified insect under the light. Often, when he pushed his chair back and announced the completion of his latest project to the family, there would be a bit of down or tuft or dubbing stuck to the edge of his lip. I did not tell him about it, but stared, fascinated, wondering how long it would take to blow away. Sometimes it never did, and I imagine he discovered the fluff in the bathroom mirror when he went upstairs to bed. Or maybe my mother plucked it off with one of those proprietary gestures of hers that irritated my brother so much. In the beginning, Father wasn't very good at the fly tying. He was a large, thick-boned man with sweeping gestures, a robust laugh, and a sudden terrifying temper. If he had not loved fishing so much, I doubt he would have ever persevered with the fussy business of the flies. After all, the job requires tools normally associated with woman's work: thread and bobbins, soft, slippery feathers, a magnifying glass, an instruction manual that read like a cookbook. It said things like, "Cut off a bunch of yellowtail, hold the tip end with the left hand, and stroke out the short hairs." But Father must have had a goal in mind. You tie flies because one day, in the not-too-distant future, you will attach them to a tippet, wade into a stream, and lure a rainbow trout out of his quiet pool. There was something endearing, almost childish, about his stubborn nightly ritual at the corner table. His head bent under the standing lamp, his fingers trembling slightly, he would whisper encouragement to himself, talk his way through some particularly delicate operation, Once or twice, I caught my mother gazing silently across my brothers' heads at him. When our eyes met, she would turn away and busy herself in the kitchen. Finally, one night, after weeks of allowing me to watch, he told me to take his seat. Why, Father? Because it's time for you to try one. That's all right. I like to watch. Nonsense, Emily. You'll do just fine. He had stood up. The chair was waiting. Across the room, my mother put down her knitting. Even the boys, embroiled in a noisy game of double solitaire, stopped their wrangling for a moment. They were all waiting to see what I would do. It was my fear of failing him that made me hesitate. I knew that my father put his trust in results, not in the learning process. Sit down, Emily. I obeyed, my heart pounding. I was a cautious, secretive child, and I could not bear to have people watch me doing things. My piano lesson was the hardest hour in the week. The teacher would sit with a resigned look on her face while my fingers groped across the keys, muddling through a sonata that I had played perfectly just an hour before. The difference was that then nobody had been watching. So we'll start you off with a big hook. He had been talking for some time. How much had I missed already? Ready? He asked. I nodded. All right, then, clamp this hook into the vise. You'll be making the golden darter, a streamer, a big flashy fly, the kind that imitates a small fish as it moves underwater. Across the room, my brothers had returned to their game, but their voices were subdued. I imagined they wanted to hear what was happening to me. My mother had left the room. Tilt the magnifying glass so you have a good view of the hook. Right. Now tie on with the bobbin thread. It took me 3 times to line the thread up properly on the hook, each silken line nesting next to its neighbor. We're going to do it right, Emily, no matter how long it takes. It's hard, I said quietly. Slowly, I grew used to the tiny tools, to the oddly enlarged view of my fingers through the magnifying glass. They looked as if they didn't belong to me anymore. The feeling in their tips was too small for their large, clumsy movements. Despite my father's repeated warnings, I nicked the floss once against the barbed hook. Luckily, it did not give way. It's Emily's bedtime, my mother called from the kitchen. Hush, she's tying in the throat. Don't bother us now. I could feel his breath on my neck. The mallard barbules were stubborn, curling into the hook in the wrong direction. Behind me, I sensed my father's fingers twisting in imitation of my own. You've almost got it, he whispered, his lips barely moving. That's right. Keep the thread slack until you're all the way around. I must have tightened it too quickly. I lost control of the feathers in my left hand, the clumsier one. First, the gold mylar came unwound, and then the yellow floss. Damn it! Now look at what you've done, he roared. And for a second I wondered whether he was talking to me. He sounded as if he were talking to a grown-up. He sounded the way he had just the night before, when an antique teacup had slipped through my mother's soapy fingers and shattered against the hard surface of the sink. I sat back slowly, resting my aching spine against the chair for the first time since we'd begun. Leave it for now, Gerald, my mother said tentatively across the kitchen. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see her sponging the kitchen counter with small, defiant sweeps of her hand. She can try again tomorrow. What happened? Called a brother. They both stared across the room toward us, but stopped at a look from my father. We'll start again, he said, his voice once more under control. Best way to learn. Get back on the horse. With a flick of his hand, he loosened the vise, removed my hook, and threw it into the wastepaper basket. From the beginning? I whispered. Of course, he replied. There's no way to rescue a mess like that. My mess had taken almost an hour to create. Gerald, my mother said again, Don't you think? How can we possibly work with all these interruptions? He thundered. I flinched as if he had hit me. Go on upstairs, all of you. Emily and I will be up when we're done. Go on, for God's sake. Stop staring at us. At a signal from my mother, the boys backed slowly away and crept up to their room. She followed them. I felt alone, as trapped under my father's piercing gaze as the hook in the grip of its vice. We started again. This time my fingers were trembling so much that I ruined 3 badger hackle feathers, stripping off the useless webbing at the tip. My father did not lose his temper again. His voice dropped to an even, controlled monotone that scared me more than his shouting. After an hour of painstaking labor, we reached the same point, with the stubborn mallard feathers curling into the hook. Once, twice, I repinched them under the throat, but each time they slipped away from me. Without a word, my father stood up and leaned over me. With his cheek pressed against my hair, he reached both hands around and took my fingers in his. I longed to surrender the tools to him and slide away off the chair, but we were so close to the end. He captured the curling stem with the thread and trapped it in place with 3 quick raps. Take your hands away carefully, he said. I'll do the whip finish. We don't want to risk losing it now. I did as I was told, sat motionless with his arms around me, my head tilted slightly to the side so he could have the clear view through the magnifying glass. He cemented the head, wiped the excess glue from the eye with a waist feather, and hung my golden darter on the tackle box handle to dry. When at last he pulled away, I breathlessly slid my body back against the chair. I was still conscious of the havoc my clumsy hands or an unexpected sneeze would wreak on the table, which was cluttered with feathers and bits of fur. Now that's the fly you tied, Emily. Isn't it beautiful? I nodded. Yes, Father. Tomorrow we'll do another one, an olive grouse. Smaller hook, but much less complicated body. Look, I'll show you in the book. As I waited to be released from the chair, I didn't think he meant it. He was just trying to apologize for having lost his temper. I told myself, just trying to pretend that our time together had been wonderful. But the next morning, when I came down late for breakfast, he was waiting for me with the materials for the olive grouse already assembled. He was ready to start in again, to take charge of my clumsy fingers with his voice and talk them through all the steps. That first time was the worst, but I never felt comfortable at the fly tying table with Father's breath tickling the hair on my neck. I completed the olive grouse, another golden darter to match the first, 2 muddler minnows, and some others. I don't remember all the names anymore. Once I hid upstairs, pretending to be immersed in my summer reading books, but he came looking for me. Emily, he called, come on down. Today we'll start the lead-winged coachman. I've got everything set up for you. I lay very still and did not answer. Gerald, I heard my mother say, leave the child alone. You're driving her crazy with those flies. Nonsense, he said, and started up the dark wooden stairs, one heavy step at a time. I put my book down and rolled slowly off the bed so that by the time he reached the door of my room, I was on my feet, ready to be led back downstairs to the table. Although we never spoke about it, my mother became oddly insistent that I join her on trips to the library or the general store. Are you going out again, Emily? My father would call after me. I was hoping we'd get some work done on this minnow. I'll be back soon, Father, I'd say. I promise. Be sure you do, he said. And for a while I did. Then, at the end of July, my old crowd of friends from across the lake began to gather, and I slipped away to join them early in the morning before my father got up. The girls were a gang. When we were all younger, we'd held bicycle relay races on the ring road and played down at the lakeside together under the watchful eyes of our mothers. Every July, we threw ourselves joyfully back into each other's lives. That summer we talked about boys and smoked illicit cigarettes in Randy Kidd's basement and held leg shaving parties in her bedroom behind a safely locked door. Randy was the ringleader. She was the one who suggested we pierce our ears. Oh, my parents would die, I said. They told me I'm not allowed to pierce my ears until I'm 17. Your hair is so long, they won't even notice, Randy said. My sister will do it for us. She's piercing all her friends' ears at college. In the end, only one girl pulled out. The rest of us sat in a row with the obligatory ice cubes held to our ears, waiting for the painful stab of the sterilized needle. Randy was right. At first, my parents didn't notice. Even when my ears became infected, I didn't tell them. All alone in my room, I went through the painful procedure of twisting the gold studs and swabbing the recent wounds with alcohol. Then, on the night of the club dance, when I had changed my clothes 3 times and played with my hair in front of the mirror for hours, I came across the small plastic box with dividers in my top bureau drawer. My father had given it to me so that I could keep my flies in separate compartments, untangled from one another. I poked my fingers in and slid one of the golden darters up along its plastic wall. When I held it up, the mylar thread sparkled in the light like a jewel. I took out another darter, hammered down the barbs of the 2 hooks, and slipped them into the raw holes in my earlobes. Someone's mother drove us all to the dance, and Randy and I pushed through the side door into the ladies' room. I pulled my hair up in a ponytail so the feathered flies could twist and dangle above my shoulders. I liked the way they made me look, free and different and dangerous even. And they made Randy notice. I've never seen earrings like that, Randy said. Where did you get them? I made them with my father. They're flies, for fishing. They're great. Can you make me some? I hesitated. I have some others at home I can give you, I said at last. They're in a box in my bureau. Can you give them to me tomorrow? She asked. Sure, I said with a smile. Randy had never noticed anything I'd worn before. I went out to the dance floor, swinging my ponytail in time to the music. My mother noticed the earrings as soon as I got home. What has gotten into you, Emily? You know you were forbidden to pierce your ears until you were in college. This is appalling. I didn't answer. My father was sitting in his chair behind the fly-tying table. His back was better by that time, but he still spent most of his waking hours in that chair. It was as if he didn't like to be too far away from his flies, as if something might blow away if he weren't keeping watch. I saw him look up when my mother started in on me. His hands drifted ever so slowly down to the surface of the table as I came across the room toward him. I leaned over so that he could see my earrings better in the light. Everybody loved them, Father. Randy says she wants a pair too. I'm going to give her the Mutler minnows. I can't believe you did this, Emily, my mother said in a loud, nervous voice. It makes you look so cheap. They don't make me look cheap, do they, Father? I swung my head so he could see how they bounced, and my hip accidentally brushed the table. A bit of rabbit fur floated up from its pile and hung in the air for a moment before it settled down on the top of the foxy quills. Oh, for God's sake, Gerald, speak to her, my mother said from her corner. He stared at me for a long moment, as if he didn't know who I was anymore, as if I were a trusted associate who had committed some treacherous and unspeakable act. That is not the purpose for which the flies were intended, he said. Oh, I know that, I said quickly, but they look good this way, don't they? He stood up and considered me in silence for a long time across the top of the table lamp. No, they don't, he said finally. They're hanging upside down. Then he turned off the light, and I couldn't see his face anymore. Thank you so much. What a pleasure and a beautiful story.
Well done, Anne. That was a lovely job. Thank you. And now, believe it or not, we've already arrived at our final story. This one is from a noted 20th century sci-fi writer, Robert Sheckley. Sheckley wrote 24 novels and hundreds of short stories, many of which were adapted into TV shows and films, including The 10th Victim. To perform our story is a versatile actor recognizable from roles in films including The Circle and Ghostbusters, as well as many series, including For All Mankind and Perry Mason. Here's Nate Corddry to read Robert Sheckley's The Accountant.
Thank you, Jane. How's my wig? Is it straight? It doesn't matter. The Accountant. Mr. D was seated in the big armchair, his belt loosened, the evening papers strewn around his knees. Peacefully, he smoked his pipe and considered how wonderful the world was. Today he had sold 2 amulets and a filter. His wife was bustling around the kitchen, preparing a delicious meal, and his pipe was drawing well. With a sigh of contentment, Mr. D yawned and stretched. Morton, his 9-year-old son, hurried across the living room, laden down with books. "How'd school go today?" Mr. D called. "Okay," the boy said, slowing down, but still moving toward his room. "What have you got there?" Mr. D asked, gesturing at his son's tall pile of books. "Just some accounting stuff," Morton said, not looking at his father. He hurried into his room. Mr. D shook his head. Somewhere the lad had picked up the notion that he wanted to be an accountant. An accountant. True, Morton was quick with figures, but he would have to forget this nonsense. Bigger things were in store for him. The doorbell rang. Mr. D tightened his belt, hastily stuffed in his shirt, and opened the front door. There stood Miss Grebe, his son's 4th grade teacher. "Come in, Miss Grebe," said Mr. D. "Can I offer you something?" "I have no time," said Miss Grebe. She stood in the doorway, her arms akimbo, with her gray, tangled hair, her thin, long-nosed face and red, runny eyes. She looked exactly like a witch. And this was as it should be, for Miss Grebe was a witch. "I've come to speak to you about your son," she said. At this moment, Miss D hurried out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "I hope he hasn't been naughty," Mrs. D said anxiously. Miss Grebe sniffed ominously. "Today I gave the yearly tests. Your son failed miserably." "Oh dear," Mrs. D said. "It's spring, perhaps." "Spring has nothing to do with it," said Miss Grebe. "Last week I assigned the greater spells of Cordis, Section 1. You know how easy they are. He didn't learn a single one." Said Mr. D succinctly. "In biology, he doesn't have the slightest notion of which are the basic conjuring herbs. Not the slightest." "This is unthinkable," said Mrs. D. Miss Grebe laughed sourly. "Moreover, he has forgotten all the secret alphabet which he learned in 3rd grade. He has forgotten the protective formula, forgotten the names of the 99 lesser imps of the 3rd circle, forgotten what little he knows of the geography of greater hell, and what's more, he doesn't want to learn." Mr. and Mrs. D looked at each other silently. This was very serious indeed. A certain amount of boyish inattentiveness was allowable, encouraged even, for it showed spirit. But a child had to learn the basics if he ever hoped to become a full-fledged wizard. "I can tell you right here and now," said Miss Grebe. "If this were the old days, I'd flunk him without another thought. But there are so few of us left. Mr. D nodded sadly. Witchcraft had been steadily declining over the centuries. The old families died out, or were snatched by demoniac forces, or became scientists. And the fickle public showed no interest whatsoever in the charms and enchantments of ancient days. Now only a scattered handful possessed the old lore, guarding it, teaching it in places like Miss Greave's private school for the children of wizards. It was a heritage, a sacred trust. "It's this accounting nonsense," said Miss Greave. "I don't know where he gets the notion." She stared accusingly at Dee. "And I don't know why it wasn't nipped in the bud." Mr. D felt his cheeks grow hot. "But I do know this. As long as Morton has that on his mind, he can't give his attention to thaumaturgy." Mr. D looked away from the witch's red eyes. It was his fault. He should never have brought home that toy adding machine. And when he first saw Morton playing at double-entry bookkeeping, he should have burned the ledger. How could he know it would grow into an obsession? Mrs. D smoothed out her apron and said, "Miss Greebe, we know you have our complete confidence. What would you suggest?" "All I can do, I have done," said Miss Greebe. "The only remaining thing is to call up Borbus, the demon of children, and that naturally is up to you." "Oh, I don't think it's that serious yet," Mr. D said quickly. "Calling up Borbus is a serious measure. As I said, that's up to you. Call Borbus or not, as you see fit. As things stand now, your son will never be a wizard." Miss Greebe turned and started to leave. "Oh, won't you stay for a cup of tea?" Mrs. D asked hastily. "No. I must attend a witch's coven in Cincinnati," said Miss Greebe, and vanished in a puff of orange smoke. They stood beside the door in silence. Mr. D was just beginning to feel the shock. It was hard to believe that his son, his own flesh and blood, did not want to carry on the family tradition. It couldn't be true. "After dinner," Mr. D said finally, "I'll have a man-to-man talk with him. I'm sure we won't need any demoniac intervention." "Good," Mrs. D said. "I'm sure you can make the boy understand." She smiled, and Mr. D caught a glimpse of the old witch light flickering behind her eyes. Dinner was a quiet meal. Morton knew that Miss Greebe had been there, and he ate in guilty silence, glancing occasionally at his father. Mr. D sliced and served the roast, frowning deeply. Mrs. D did not even attempt any small talk. After bolting his dessert, the boy hurried to his room. "Now we'll see," Mr. D said to his wife. He finished the last of his coffee, wiped his mouth, and stood up. "I am going to reason with him now. Where is my amulet of persuasion?" Mrs. D thought deeply for a moment. Then she walked across the room to the bookcase. "Here it is," she said, lifting it from the pages of a brightly jacketed novel. "I was using it as a marker." Mr. D slipped the amulet into his pocket, took a deep breath, and entered his son's room. Morton was seated at his desk. In front of him was a notebook, scribbled with figures and tiny, precise notations. On his desk were 6 carefully sharpened pencils, a soap eraser, an abacus, and a toy adding machine. His books hung precariously over the edge of the desk. There was Money by Rimromer, Bank Accounting Practice by Johnson and Calhoun, Ellman's Studies for the CPA, and a dozen others. Mr. D pushed aside a mound of clothes and made room for himself in the bed. "How's it going, son?" he asked in his kindest voice. Fine, Dad, Morton answered eagerly. I'm up to chapter 4 in basic accounting, and I answered all the questions. Son, Mr. D broke in, speaking very softly. How about your regular homework? You know, not many boys have a chance to become wizards in this day and age. Yes, sir, I know. Morton looked away abruptly. In a high, nervous voice, he said, But Dad, I want to be an accountant. I really do, Dad. Mr. D shook his head. Morton, there's always been a wizard in our family. For 1,800 years, the D's have been famous in supernatural circles. Morton continued to look out the window and scuff his feet. You wouldn't want to disappoint me, would you, son? Mr. D smiled sadly. You know, anyone can be an accountant, but only a chosen few can master the black arts. Morton turned away from the window. He picked up a pencil, inspected the point, and began to turn it slowly in his figures. How about it, boy? Won't you work harder for Miss Grebe? Morton shook his head. I want to be an accountant. Mr. D contained his sudden rush of anger with difficulty. What was wrong with the amulet of persuasion? Could the spell have run down? He should have recharged it. Nevertheless, he went on. How about it, son? You won't have to work in a store. You can be a direct agent of the Dark One. What do you say, boy? For a moment, Mr. D thought his son was moved. Morton's lips parted, and there was a brightness in his eyes. But then the boy glanced at his accounting books, his little abacus, his toy adding machine. I'm going to be an accountant, he said. We'll see, Mr. D shouted, all his patience gone. You will not be an accountant, young man. You will be a wizard. It was good enough for the rest of your family, and by all that's damnable, it'll be good enough for you. You haven't heard the last of this, young man. And he stormed out of the room. Immediately, Morton returned to his accounting books. Mr. and Mrs. D sat together on the couch, not talking. Mrs. D was busily knitting a wind cord, but her mind wasn't on it. Mr. D stared moodily at a worn spot in the living room rug. Finally, he said, I've spoiled him. Borbus is the only solution. Oh, no, Mrs. D said hastily. He's so young. Do you want your son to be an accountant? Mr. D asked bitterly. Do you want him to grow up scribbling with figures instead of doing the Dark One's important work? Of course not, said Mrs. D. But Borbus, I know. I feel like a murderer already. They thought for a few moments. Then Mrs. D said, Perhaps his grandfather can do something. He was always fond of the boy. Oh, perhaps he can, Mr. D said thoughtfully. But I don't know if we should disturb him. After all, the old gentleman has been dead for 3 years. I know, Mrs. D said, undoing an incorrect knot in the wind cord. But it's either that or Borbus. Mr. D agreed. Unsettling as it would be to Morton's grandfather, Borbus was infinitely worse. Immediately, D made preparations for calling up his dead father. He gathered together the henbane, the ground uniform's horn, the hemlock, together with a morsel of dragon's tooth. These he placed on the rug. Oh, where's my wand? He asked his wife. I put it in the bag with your golf sticks, she told him. Mr. D got his wand and waved it over the ingredients. He muttered the 3 words of the unbinding and called out his father's name. Immediately, a wisp of smoke arose from the rug. Hello, Grandpa D, Mrs. D said. Dad, I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. D said. But my son, your grandson, refuses to become a wizard. He wants to be an accountant. The wisp of smoke trembled, then straightened out, and described a character of the old language. Yes, Mr. D said. We tried persuasion. The boy is adamant. Again the smoke trembled and formed another character. I suppose that's best, Mr. D said. If you frighten him out of his wits once and for all, he'll forget this accounting nonsense. It's cruel, but it's better than Borbus. The wisp of smoke nodded and streamed toward the boy's room. Mr. and Mrs. D sat down on the couch. The door of Morton's room was slammed open, as though by a gigantic wind. Morton looked up, frowned, and returned to his books. The wisp smoke turned into a winged lion with the tail of a shark. It roared hideously, crouched, snarled, and gathered itself for a spring. Morton glanced at it, raised both eyebrows, and proceeded to jot down a column of figures. The lion changed into a three-headed lizard, its flank reeking horribly of blood. Breathing gusts of fire, the lizard advanced on the boy. Morton finished adding the column of figures, checked the result on an abacus, and looked at the wizard. With a screech, the lizard changed into a giant gibbering bat. It fluttered around the boy's head, moaning and gibbering. Morton grinned, and turned back to his books. Mr. D was unable to stand it any longer. Damn it, he shouted. Aren't you scared? Why should I be? Morton asked. It's only Grandpa. Upon the word, the bat dissolved into a plume of smoke. It nodded sadly to Mr. D, bowed to Mrs. D, and vanished. Goodbye, Grandpa, Morton called. He got up and closed his door. That does it, Mr. D said. The boy is too cocksure of himself. We must call up Borbus. No, his wife said. What then? He's so young, Mrs. D wailed. It will be traumatic. If so, we will use all the resources of modern psychology to heal him, Mr. D said soothingly. He will have the best psychoanalysts money can buy, but the boy must be a wizard. Go ahead then, Mrs. D said, crying openly. But please don't ask me to assist you. How like a woman, Mr. D thought, always turning into jelly at the moment when firmness was indicated. With a heavy heart, he made the preparations for calling up Borbus, demon of children. First came the intricate sketching of the pentagon, the 12-pointed star within it, the endless spiral within that. Then came the herbs and essences, expensive items, but absolutely necessary for the conjuring. Then came the inscribing of the protective spell so that Borbus might not break loose and destroy them all. Then came the 3 drops of hippogriff blood. Where is my hippogriff blood? Mr. D asked, rummaging through the living room cabinet. In the kitchen, in the aspirin bottle, Mrs. D said, wiping her eyes. Mr. D found it, and all was in readiness. He lighted the black candles and chanted the unlocking spell. The room was suddenly very warm, and there remained only the naming of the name. Morton, Mr. D called. Come here. Morton opened the door and stepped out, holding one of his accounting books tightly, looking very young and defenseless. Morton, I am about to call up the demon of children. Don't make Me do it, Morton. The boy turned pale, shrank back against the door, but stubbornly he shook his head. Very well, Mr. D said. Borbus! There was an ear-splitting clap of thunder and a wave of heat, and Borbus appeared, as tall as the ceiling, chuckling evilly. Ah! cried Borbus, in a voice that shook the room. Little boy! Morton gaped, his jaw open and eyes bulging. Ah! A naughty little boy! Borbus said and laughed. The demon marched forward, shaking the house with every stride. Oh, send him away, Mrs. D cried. I can't, Mr. D said, his voice breaking. I can't do anything until he's finished. The demon's great horned hands reached for Morton. But quickly, the boy opened the accounting book. Save me, he screamed. In that instant, a tall, terribly thin old man appeared, covered with worn pen points and ledger sheets, his eyes 2 empty zeros. Sicko, picko, real, chanted Borbus, turning to grapple with the newcomer. But the thin old man laughed and said, a contract of a corporation which is ultra vires is not voidable only, but utterly void. At these words, Borbus was flung back, his skin glowing red-hot rage. He intoned the demoniac master spell. Rat! Hat! Ho! But the thin old man shielded Morton with his body and cried the words of dissolution. Expiration, repeal, occurrence, surrender, abandonment, and death. Yeah! Borbus squeaked in agony. Hastily he backed away, fumbling in the air until he found the opening. He jumped through and was gone. The tall, thin old man turned to Mr. and Mrs. D, cowering in a corner of the living room, and said, know that I am the accountant, and know, moreover, that this child has signed a compact with me to enter my apprenticeship and be my servant. And in return for his services rendered, I, the accountant, am teaching him the damnation of souls by means of ensnaring them in a cursed web of figures, forms, torts, and reprisals. And behold, this is my mark upon him. The accountant held up Morton's right hand and showed the ink smudge on his third finger. He turned to Morton and in a softer voice said, tomorrow, lad, we will consider some aspects of income tax evasion as a path to damnation. Yes, sir, Morton said eagerly. And with another sharp look at the D's, the accountant vanished. For long seconds, there was silence. Mr. D turned to his wife. Well, he said, if the boy wants to be an accountant that bad, I'm sure not going to stand in his way.
Thank you, Nate. And we would like to thank each of our actors once again. Randall Park and Dowd and Nate Corddry. And we would like to say thank you to all of the authors and their respective agents for allowing us permission to read their stories in these special circumstances. But please, I beg you, don't send us thank you notes for thanking you because, well, you know how things can escalate from there. And finally, I want to remind you to everyone who made time to come to our show, if you enjoyed yourself, keep in mind that we'll soon have more dates of shows later in the summer and into the fall. And you can keep tabs on us at selectedshorts.org or on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Be sure to check out your weekly radio show and podcast by supporting your local public radio station or downloading the show on Apple Podcasts. I'm Jane Kaczmarek. Be safe, be well, and we'll see you the next time on Selected Shorts. Thank you.